Okay, now let's talk a little bit about thickening agents. This is where we're going to start the sauce section, because you have to have a concept of thickening agent in order to make your sauces. So let's start here with what you're looking for when you thicken a sauce is something called nappy, and that's where the consistency will coat the back of a spoon. Kind of is seen here in this picture. So you want to create a nappy type sauce. You don't want it too thick. It depends on what you're looking for exactly as well. So you can get some thicker ones, but you don't want to make it like Jello or Play-Doh. And I have seen some kids that will do that as well. So it depends on what you're working with, what thickening agent we're working with, and what sauce you're making as to just how you want to make, how thick you want to make it. Okay, let's see. Moving along, let's talk about different thickening agents that we have. We have arrowroot and cornstarch, which is what we're going to talk about here in slurries. We're going to make slurries first. And a Bouirmanie is a butter infused, and liaison is a little bit of cream towards the end. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but that's not something we're really going to do a whole lot with right now. We are going to talk about arrowroot and cornstarch. These are two vegetable-based starches that can be used to thicken sauces. A lot of times, arrowroot and cornstarch are used to thicken sauces when people are trying to be a little bit healthier, because the standard thickening agent roux, which we will discuss in a few minutes, is fat and flour, where cornstarch and arrowroot are done without any fat. So it reduces the fat in some of the sauces. And when you talk about healthy cooking, a lot of times cornstarches and arrowroots are the way to go for that. The other thing is you have gluten-free, uh, celiac patients or people who are trying to stay away from gluten, that a cornstarch slurry to thicken a sauce is going to work out a lot better than a heavy fat and flour roux. However, you can use alternative flours in a standard roux, like an almond flour or a nut flour, to make a gluten-free roux as well. All right, a slurry. Slurry is made from a starch and a liquid. Once again, that can be arrowroot. Typically, it's done with cornstarch. Cornstarch is a real popular kitchen item. I'm pretty sure that most of you have some cornstarch at home in the cupboard. If not, just ask mom. If not, it's very inexpensive. It's easy to come by. You won't need a whole lot for this class, but we will talk about the labs you need and the grocery list you need will be in the instruction sheet as well. You're going to use a starch wet. You never really want to throw starch on top of a stock and try to thicken it that way. You always want to break down that starch into a cool liquid. So I usually put like a tablespoon of cornstarch into 1 or 2 tablespoons of water and mix it up, making almost a thin paste. It's almost a milky type consistency. And then I pour that, once I make sure there's no lumps or anything, I pour that into my stock in order to thicken it up. If you want to, you don't have to use water. You can use the liquid. It has to be cold, but you can use chicken stock to thicken that or to add that cornstarch to. You can use a little wine. You can use a little juice. So it all depends on what you're making. For example, if you were making a fruit sauce, you might use a little bit of fruit juice to mix that starch in with in order before you incorporate that into a fruit sauce. Or if you were making a chicken stock, you could use a cold chicken stock to mix that starch into. Moving along, slurries give you a couple of a slurry thickening agent has some limitations. You cannot hold sauces very long, and typically you can't hold it hot for a long period of time. So if you're using a slurry as a thickening agent, it's something that's going to be served either cold or served right away. So I'm going to give you some examples. Sometimes we'll use slurry when we're making fruit pie fillings. We'll use a cornstarch slurry or something to thicken it up, along with sometimes pectin and some other things. Because we're going to cool that slurry down, and we'll have a fruit sauce that's cold for cold applications, it'll work. But if we're going to take that slurry and cool it down and then throw it into a pie and bake it, heating that fruit sauce up again, we might have some problems with a slurry. So it's not even recommended for that. Okay, so it's really, really good for quick applications. And typically, your slurries aren't going to even give you all of its thickening capabilities until the product you added the slurry to is completely cool. Okay, so yes, you can add starch slurry to a hot stock and make it be nappy to where it coats the spoon. However, if you really, really wanted a thickened sauce, let that stock cool, because by the time you get it to nappy consistency, as it cools, it will actually continue to thicken, and you'll have almost like a jello paste by the time that sauce is completely cool. Okay, 4 tablespoons of cornstarch will thicken 1 quart of liquid. So that's why we're going to use 1 tablespoon, and you're going to thicken 1 cup of water, and that's what we're going to do. And you're going to mix that 1 tablespoon into a tablespoon of water and make that little paste, and you're going to add that to a cup of boiling water, and then you're going to track it as it cools. And that's going to be one of your first experiments here. And your experiment with thickening agents is going to be one of the labs that we do first here. So that's something you'll be doing this week. You don't have to season your water. We talk about bring to a boil, season, and use it immediately here on this slide, but we're not going to have you tasting the water or adding any seasoning. Thickening water does 2 things for me. It's a great, inexpensive lab. We've done it in the kitchen. It's something you can do at home. Cornstarch and water is all the 2 ingredients you need. And it allows you to see, because of the way water acts, it allows you to see what slurry will do, because water is clear, right? Typically, hopefully, your water is clear and you can't see a lot of stuff floating in it. So water is clear. When you add that cornstarch, it adds a cloudiness and makes your water almost, as it cools, you're going to notice it's almost like a gray color. That's the starch in it. So it's very important, because this shows you what the starch will look like in your sauces, what it's doing to your sauces. You can't use a slurry starch to have a clear sauce, typically. But however, there are things you can't use a roux to have a clear sauce either. There are components you can use. There are modified food starches out on the market. One's called Clear Gel, which is a modified food starch available typically commercially. You don't see a lot of it at the grocery stores for home use. But a clear gel will allow it to gelatinize, just like cornstarch. It is a modified starch, essentially, is what it is. But it will allow it to also stay clear. So it'll allow your sauces to stay clear. And sometimes, depending on your application, that's something that's important that you want to keep, that you want to do. Okay, so that's a little bit about slurry, and your first lab will be about slurries, so please be sure to follow the directions. Remember, and I'm going to reiterate this several times probably in this video and several times throughout the year, as long as we're on distance learning or hybrid learning, if you're distancing at home, you're having problems with any of these labs, please reach out to me via Remind, via Teams chat. Remember, Teams chat is not private between you and I. It's group. So Remind and email is private. You can also call me on the syllabus is my office number. Please reach out to me if you have any problems at all. I want to make sure you guys get through this. And I know I reiterate this again, it's difficult times. I would love to be showing you this. We just don't have the camera operations to show you all the demonstrations. If I'm trying to do a demonstration right now, I'd have to hold the camera, and it's not going to work. So it's a little bit complicated for us right now, but I want to make sure you guys understand. So reach out to me if you have any questions. Okay, we're going to move on to the next one, and I'm not doing these thickening agents in any necessary order. However, I am doing it in the order that we're going to do the labs, but it doesn't matter. Slurries first because we're going to thicken water using a slurry. The next thing you're going to do is make a mayonnaise, which is not necessarily a derivative sauce of the mother sauce, grand sauce, hollandaise, but it is something that most of you are familiar with. It goes on sandwiches, it goes in salads. You're familiar with mayonnaise typically. So we're going to make mayonnaise at home. And I'll tell you, you guys, some of you know, maybe because it's Culinary One, many of you don't know, I do not particularly like mayonnaise at all. Keep it completely away from me. I don't put it on sandwiches. I don't put it. I mean, I'll eat it in chicken salad and tuna salad and macaroni salad and potatoes. I'll eat it and things like along those lines. But I don't like mayonnaise. However, if it is a homemade mayonnaise and not a packaged product like Best Foods and definitely not Miracle Whip, I will eat it because if you make a fresh mayonnaise, you can season it to your liking, you can make it to your liking, and there's nothing better than a fresh made mayonnaise if handled properly. So that's going to be your emulsion, and that's what we're going to talk about next is emulsification. And this is usually what an emulsification means. It's mixing unmixable liquids. Okay, and I think I put a link into the instructions on an optional emulsification video you can watch. You do not have to, however, if you're interested in knowing exactly how emulsifications work, I highly recommend you watch the video. It's about 10 minutes long, and it's a really, really good video that explains a little bit about emulsifications particularly, and they use, because emulsifications use a lot of things like mayonnaise and salad dressings and things to talk about that, even though it's a scientific principle that goes beyond the kitchen. Even the scientists use kitchens material like mayonnaise and salad dressings to talk about emulsification. A perfect example of an emulsification is take an oil and vinegar. Okay, oil and vinegar mixtures do not typically blend together. Think of your vinaigrette in your refrigerator, oil and vinegar salad dressing in your refrigerator. If you look at it, you always have to shake it up and create that temporary emulsification before you put it on your salads. Otherwise, you get straight vinegar from the top, or actually oil from the top, or and vinegar from below, depending on how it pours out. But if you want it to be emulsified, you want to shake that up first. Those are what's known as temporary emulsifications. And if you want to see the separation, the best way to do that is just take a little glass or a little glass jar and pour a little vinegar in it and pour a little salad oil on it. And you will see in a couple of minutes the separation where the oil will sit on top, because typically oil has a lighter viscosity than the vinegar. So the same principle in a permanent emulsification like mayonnaise or some salad dressings. The things you can use to create a permanent emulsification has a name, and that video will show you the name, and it's completely escaped me now what they call it. But these compounds will help keep an emulsification permanent, and these are things like egg. Egg will do that, and that's what you're doing in a mayonnaise, using egg yolk, and a mustard will keep that. So when you're making a salad dressing, you want it to stay together. A lot of times people will put a little mustard in it. Even though it may not be a mustard flavored salad dressing, if they put a little mustard in it, it will allow that emulsification to maintain and stay emulsified. It allows the fat particles to stay small instead of binding together again. So what happens in an emulsification is you keep it separated, then you have a sauce that is consistent all the way through, and you have the fat particles separated amongst your other liquids. So in like oil and vinegar, you have a fat from the oils particles completely separated in the vinegar, and that makes your oil vinegar. The mustard or egg would hold it in that. So in the mayonnaise that you're going to make, you're basically putting oil into the fat from egg yolks. So the egg yolks have multiple purpose here. They're going to act as a catalyst for keeping the emulsification together. And B, they're going to provide the fat compound to the oil, or the fat content for the oil to mix in with to make the mayonnaise. And the oil is also going to be the fat content. So your other things that you're putting in there, like vinegar and seasonings, are going to be your other compound or your water compound. There's also water in the egg yolks that's going to act as the other half of that emulsification beyond fat. The important thing to know when working with a hollandaise or a mayonnaise type sauce is you're taking egg yolks and you're slowly incorporating oil. And in the beginning, you must be very, very slow and gentle about it, because if you add too much oil, the oil molecules will find themselves together, they will bind together, and they will do what's called breaking your sauce. It's a typical term that we talk about when you talk about a hollandaise or a mayonnaise sauce breaking. You talk about the fact that now it is impossible to get it to incorporate, to separate and become mayonnaise or to become hollandaise. So you really want to add your oil slow, almost a drop at a time. So be sure to watch. I've got a Jamie Oliver video on making mayonnaise. He's got a slight English, well, not really a slight, it's kind of a heavy English accent, and he works really fast because it's Jamie Oliver. But watch that video, and he talks a little bit about incorporating. He talks about how fast you can add in the oil in the beginning, and then you can add a little bit more. So there's a video from Jamie Oliver on making mayonnaise. Be sure to watch that and I want you to watch that while you have that recipe in front of you. Anything else on emulsifications? Remember, you should be following up this by reading chapter 6 of your textbook. And I broke it down the chapter into different sections on the instructions. Just, a couple of pages on emulsification that comes from that book. And that's the emulsification section, and we're going to be making mayonnaise. It's a little bit more popular at home for you guys, and we're probably going to be doing the mayonnaise also within the first 2 weeks distance ed. And I know many of you are at home all year long, and that's fine. That's why we're doing this way. You can work with hollandaise. Hollandaise differs from mayonnaise in a couple of different things. Number one, you're going to heat up the eggs. Your goal with a hollandaise is you're going to make a warm sauce. So you're going to heat up the eggs, and you're going to incorporate, typically it's clarified butter, which is butter that the impurities in the water have been removed. However, in a lot of cases these days, we're just using whole butter, which means we're using all of it. So we're just going to melt the whole butter, and we're going to incorporate that into our egg yolks, and we're going to make hollandaise. And hollandaise is really popular on Eggs Benedict. It's really popular. Béarnaise sauce is popular a lot on steaks and red meat. And Béarnaise sauce is typically hollandaise with a little bit of white wine and tarragon put in it. The fresher, the better on that. So that's the difference there. And those are derivatives. So check out that sheet that I put on sauces in this section that we're talking about right now. No, I'm sorry, it was in the sauce section, not in the thickening agent section we're talking about. But make sure to check out that, because it shows you the derivative sauces and what kind of ingredients go in those derivative sauces. We are going to be making derivative sauces, but not of mayonnaise. We're just going to be making the mayonnaise. That's going to be our emulsification sauce for the class. Okay, moving along to the next one, we're going to talk now about roux. And roux is equal parts of flour and fat. Once again, I mentioned that typically we're using a wheat flour for this, an all-purpose, a bread flour, even a pastry flour. The gluten level is not as important in a roux as the thickening capabilities, which will come from the gluten, but it'll also come from the starch. It doesn't necessarily take that much gluten in order to create the sauces that we're looking for. Just keep in mind when you're adding regular wheat flour, that is not going to be able to be served to someone with any gluten intolerance at all. So for that, you can use almond flour, and you can use rice flour and a few other flours. For a roux, keep in mind, however, their thickening capabilities may not be as powerful, which means you might have to use more roux than we're going to talk about how much roux you need to put into sauces here. You're going to need to use a little bit more roux. I apologize about the picture. It came in a little bit differently because it was from a different slide deck from On Cooking, and I'm taking bits and pieces and putting my own together. So the white is supposed to be on the top one, the blonde is the bottom left, and the brown is the bottom right. So those three roux are based on cooking time. So if you take a white roux, you blend, usually you melt your fat, or if it's an oil and you're starting with a fat, then you're good. You add your flour, you mix it in until you get a paste. At that point, you stop cooking it right there. You have yourself a white roux. White roux has the most thickening power of all three of the roux. Okay, it's used for white sauces like a bechamel. It's used for other white sauces that you might want to make, any derivatives of bechamel, like perhaps a cheese sauce, a Mornay sauce, or something along those lines. The next one down is a blonde roux. You make it the same way, but you cook it a little bit longer. You cook it for a few minutes. It starts to turn a little yellow. Depending on the oil you're using, sometimes your blonde roux can actually be more white than your white roux. So it depends on the fat you're using. If you're using a butter, typically it will go blonde because of the sugars in the butter and caramelization a little bit. But if you're using a salad oil, sometimes it's a real fine line to tell between the white and the blonde. So you got to do it by aroma. You got to smell for that slightly nutty smell, and you got to keep an eye on it and see. But it sometimes will get actually whiter than a white roux when you're going to blonde if you're using a salad oil. The other one is brown roux, and this is where we're going to start caramelizing some of the sugars in the starch in the flours, as well as if there's any sugars in our fat, depending on what fat we're using. If we're using margarine, sometimes there could be some sugar in it. Typically not too much in regular butter. However, we will see some caramelization effects. That's how we make things like brown butter and things along those lines. But what we're going to do is you're going to continue to cook it until it turns brown. Here you're going to really get a very pungent and very appealing nutty type aroma. So if you like the smell of nuts, heating like almonds or chestnuts or anything, well, not really a chestnut type odor, but pretty close to an almond or a walnut type odor as you heat them up. That's the nuttiness you're going to get when you're going to smell that roux. And it's going to be dark, and it's going to be a little bit darker and brown. But like I said, as we cook this starch out in our roux, it lowers the thickening capacity of the roux. So you'll need to add a little bit more brown roux to a brown stock for an Espanol than you would a blonde roux to a veloute or a white to a bechamel. Okay, I hope that makes sense. The more we cook our roux, the less thickening power it has. But when you add a roux to a stock to make your sauce, if you add a white roux or a blonde roux, you really need to cook that sauce because that starch has to be cooked out, or you're going to add a bland, starchy flavor to your sauces. It's not that it's undesirable. It's not like it's going to make you go ew, but it's not going to make your sauce as tasty as you kind of would like it. There's a fourth roux not pictured here, and it's a fine line on this roux. The French and the Cajuns use this down in Louisiana, and it's called the blackened roux. And you take that brown roux to the next level, but there's a fine line between blackened roux and burnt roux. So you got to be really, really careful because you are getting that almost to black. And they use a lot of that in Cajun foods. Typically, sometimes it will get a little burnt flavor to it, but what they'll do is they'll hide that with a lot of heavy-duty Cajun spices that make it real spicy. So, but that's a blackened roux. We don't talk about that much here, but if you ever have a chance to use that, that is another roux that's out there as well, and it's just 4 stages. We are going to take the roux and we're going to make it to these 3 stages. You're going to take a certain amount of roux, and I don't have that figure in my head. It's on the recipe. And you're going to mix so much flour and so much fat, and your fat can home. I'm going to give you the option of margarine. I really don't want you using butter because it's so expensive. I'd rather use margarine, or if mom's got vegetable oil at home, you can just use vegetable oil, okay, and flour. It's just simple that way. And if you use vegetable oil and flour, typically you don't have to necessarily refrigerate the roux. However, I would like you to refrigerate the roux because you're going to use a couple of them later on. The white and the blonde, particularly the brown roux, I want you to make because I want you to smell that pungent nuttiness. I want you to see the color change. But I don't know if we're going to get a chance in our sauce labs to utilize that one. Maybe I'll let you utilize that for the extra credit you guys are always wanting in this class. So maybe I'll throw up an extra credit um, sauce assignment that we don't have time for, but if you have time for, go for it. Okay, so based on the roux you're going to take and you're going to incorporate your fat and flour, and then you're going to pull out a little bit, 1/3 of it. Then you're going to cook it to a blonde consistency. Then you're going to pull out 1/3 of it. So now we have pulled out some white, we pulled out some blonde, and then you're going to cook the last bit of it into the brown consistency. So you'll end up with, let's just say I say, just for example, 1.5 cups of fat, 1.5 cups of flour. It will make 3 cups of roux, right? Because it's equal parts. So that's 3 cups. So then you pull out 1 cup of white, 1 cup of blonde, 1 cup of brown. Okay, so that's how much roux you'll have. Typically, that's probably more than I want you to do, but that was just an example there. Okay, let's take a look at roux and how you make them a little bit more in detail. So they are flour-based. We talked about that. It's used for stews, sauces, braised meats. They're very, very stable. They work on a steam table. They'll work in things like stew that you keep hot, chilies, soups. And as we go into soup, you're going to see when we do thickened soups, there's a couple different methods of thickening that we're going to talk about here in this video that we use, but roux is definitely one of them. A white, blonde, and brown roux. We also talked about the Cajun roux, the blackened roux, which some chefs use. Equal amounts of fat and flour by weight. That's very, very important. You're not going to talk about a cup of flour and a cup of butter. You must make sure they're equal by weight for a roux to work out perfectly well. Now, I've had some chefs also that will add, when you typically do a 50-50 of roux, your fat and your oil, it's mixing together and it's making a paste. It's kind of a runny paste, so you could actually almost pour it. Not quite, I mean, it's a little thicker than a pancake batter or something along those lines, but it is a paste. I've had chefs that have added more flour to it and made it almost the consistency of not quite a bread dough, but thicker, lumpier substance. It doesn't necessarily affect the roux any better. To me, in my travels, in my history of culinary arts, I can tell you that adding that extra flour to me has become problematic in some regards because typically, yes, flour is cheaper than the oil product you're putting into it. So a lot of chefs do that to save money. But on the other side of it, as you see when we started talking about incorporating roux into sauces, you're going to see that the thicker the roux done with flour like that, the larger your chances of getting lumpy flour bits in your sauce. And everybody loves dumplings and chicken and dumplings. Nobody wants to bite into a raw flour chunk. It's not very good. Okay. So you need 12 ounces of roux typically to thicken a gallon of liquid. So that's why I say that cups is going to be too much. That would be a cup with like 8 ounces of roux. We're not going to be doing that much sauces at home. So we're going to be doing smaller amounts. So I'm probably going to cut that down. You might see a cup and a half. So we have 4 ounces of roux, 4 ounces of each color roux, and you won't be adding all that anyway. I talked about that. The darker the roux, the less the thickening power. Okay. And larger amounts can be made in a roast pan or a brazier. But we're making really small, not even home amounts. I mean, I made probably more turkey gravy for my family than you guys are going to make. I made, and basically that was a turkey velouté is what I made. And you're not going to make that much velouté at home when we do our velouté at home. So just this very, very small amount. Okay, looking at roux, you're going to incorporate The hot roux, so you're mixing the flour and the fat together with a warm liquid, okay, or a hot liquid to room temperature roux. And that's typically what happens is we make our roux ahead of time and we refrigerate it and we pull it out, we get it to room temperature. Then we heat up our stock, we get it going, we add the roux that we need to, and a couple of things. Number one, it will prevent splattering. You don't want to add hot and hot. And it also allows less chances for roux balls. What we call roux balls would be that unpleasant dumpling I was talking about earlier. Okay, so here's some pictures here. You must simmer the sauce after you've added the roux to eliminate the raw flour taste or that starchy flavor that I talked about earlier. Okay, here's a couple of videos. Cold stock, hot roux. Add to hot roux, whisking vigorously. So if you added the stock to roux, you could do it that way. The other way to do it is, of course, my favorites, hot stock and room temperature roux. You take that's because I typically make more roux than I need, and then I add the roux to my sauce until I get the consistency I want. Now, when adding roux to sauce, it will thicken as it cools, but typically you're adding it to a sauce that you're going to serve hot, or to a stew, or to a soup, and you want it to be the consistency you want it to be hot. You don't want to rely on it to cool like you would a fruit sauce. You won't want to rely on that thickening to happen while it cools. When you make cranberry sauce at Thanksgiving or Christmas, if you're not opening a can, if you're making cranberry sauce, you've added the sugar, you've added everything, and then you want it to cool and gelatinize as it cools. You're not doing that when you're making this. That's why I like to do the room temperature roux in my hot stock, because I know that's the hot stock is the temperature I want my product to be served. So I'm adding the roux till I get the desired consistency, and that's why that's one of my favorite is adding the room temperature roux to hot stock. Okay, long one here. Other ways we can talk about, and we're going to be working with some of these, is reduction. Reduction is another way to thicken a product. It typically will not thicken a sauce. It's like taking water and putting it on the stove and reducing it. It doesn't really get any thicker. You can reduce it to nothing, and we have what we call dehydrated water, but that's a whole other story. But what you can do is reduce a thickened sauce. So let's take an example, and you are going to be making one of these. The tomato sauce that you're going to be making is typically going to be thickened by reduction. And you're going to reduce the amount of water or liquid in there through evaporation. It's going to thicken a little bit more. And that's another way we talk about thickening agents. Another way we talk about thickening, and this also can happen with a tomato sauce, typically not, hopefully in the recipe I give you, because I cannot assume you have too much at home. But if you had a blender or something at home to blend it, is puree. Pureeing a tomato or something along those lines, it can help thicken a sauce as well. So we have of course emulsification. We have roux for thickening, okay, or a slurry. So we'll call slurry number 3. We have reduction number 4, and we have puree number 5. So there's essentially 5 ways to thicken a sauce or a soup or something along those lines. And these are consistent. So when you talk about these thickening agents here, I might add this portion of this lecture and things to the soup section when we do the soups next. But typically that should only be a refresher for you. You should not have to watch this video again if you watched it the first time. All right. Finishing techniques. Always when you're using particularly a roux, you always want to strain your stock. Not necessarily when you've done a puree stock do you want to strain it. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you want to strain out things. But a puree stock is typically where you're pureeing a tomato or a carrot, and you're using that pulp of that vegetable or fruit as the sauce itself. So if you strained out all that pulp, you'd end up with water. So typically you don't strain those, but you will want to strain a stock done with roux, a regular mother sauce, grand sauce. Derivatives you may not be able to strain, because once you've added, let's say, herbs to an herb sauce, herb veloute, okay, or mushrooms to a mushroom sauce, you don't want to strain out the mushrooms. You want them in there. So we're talking about straining mother sauces. So typically, you're going to take your sauce, you're going to finish it by straining it through a china cap, sometimes through cheesecloth to make sure it's nice and smooth. We don't have any roux clumps of roux in there. We got rid of all those. And we have a nice sauce that we can then add to make a derivative or baby sauce from. And that is thickening agents. Once again, reach out to me if you have any questions about thickening agents. This is actually in chapter 6 of your book as well, so make sure to look there. But I'm bringing resources in from all over the place. You'll see a sauce section that talks about thickening agent that I created with the derivatives. It'll talk about, for example, a veloute sauce would be a chicken stock with a blonde roux that makes veloute, and you're going to add herbs to that, and you're going to make an herb sauce. You can add mushrooms to it and make a mushroom veloute sauce. So there's several different things you can do to the sauces. So please pay attention to those. I do not expect you to commit all the derivative sauces to memory. However, I do expect to say, hey, so-and-so, give me a derivative sauce of hollandaise. And as hollandaise is the mother sauce, you can give me béarnaise, you can give me mayonnaise. I might say, what's a derivative of veloute? And you can say herb, mushroom. What's a derivative of espagnole? You should be able to rattle off a couple of derivatives, but you don't necessarily need to have them all memorized. But please look over that derivative list as well in the sauces so we have that. All right, guys, that's all I got for now. Take care and good luck.